Thanks, Andy. And this is Dave Dickinson. Let me start out with a little bit of clarification. We're going to take a walkaway break about an hour into this session, and I'll also be taking questions probably right before that, depending on how many come in during the first hour. Maybe we'll take a few after we come back from the walkaway break, and then when I get done, hopefully there'll be sufficient time to take another Q&A break at the very end, so an hour and 45 minutes from now. So maybe there'll be 2 Q&A sessions, I'm saying. Hopefully you've got the materials downloaded, and if you do, there's a table of contents I'd like to have you look at so that you can tell how I'm going to cover this material, and so you can ask your questions maybe during the appropriate time. There's a little bit of overlap between this webinar and the one we held a week ago about what is an application, because to set up the joint intent topic, you have to know, do you have an application? And that's what the last webinar for 2 hours was, just on that. So I'll spend a couple pages talking about what is an application, very high level again, and then we're going to get into the bulk of really what today's topic is about, and that's who can you require to sign, and if there's more than one person to sign, documenting that intent to be a joint applicant. So we'll start talking through who these different players are. When we get down to page 9, we'll start talking about that documentation specifically. There's a ton of supplemental information starting really back there on Roman number 4, page 19 through 28, and I've grabbed a bunch of frequently asked questions from previous times that I've taught this, some bankers threads, some BOL guru FAQs, and I won't go through all those, but I want you to know they're back there so that you have supplemental information, and those will all be things that you can find, maybe a scenario that you're facing that will answer that. So we won't be really discussing applications in depth is what I want to clarify. Again, that's something we talked about last week, and I do have a link to the webinar last week if you weren't with us. So also on the bottom of that table of contents, there's a bullet down there that says everything you see in italics, I'm quoting from the regulation. So let's go to page 1 and you'll see what I'm talking about. In fact, starting out every training topic, there's usually some definitions. You'll see lots of italics. I'm very big on teaching you how to fish rather than hand you a fish. So at the end of every one of those paragraphs, you'll see the reference. So section 1002.2F, for instance, is the definition of application. You can go look that up for further information yourself, or the commentary, or maybe it's coming from a memo, financial institution letter, etc. And so just want you to know how to dig deeper, how to educate yourself, and then you need to know it for yourself, not because Dave Dickinson said or you read it on Bankers Online, because you've researched it. So, well, let's get started. Let's get to page 1. Again, briefly overviewing what is an application, and the key to letter A there is that it can be oral, and that's also key that when we get into joint intent, and I'm going to let the cat out of the bag, you're to document multiple applicants or joint applicants' intent at the time of application. So you need to know what an application is, and an application can be oral. Now, if you were sitting in front of me, I'd hold up a piece of paper, and it's marked at the top, application, or maybe it's a Fannie Mae 1003, and we all know that those are application forms, and here it comes. No, they're not. Those are pieces of paper that document the application. That an application is a verbal or written request for credit. Don't read any more into it than that. In fact, here's another thing that I need you to understand right now, is this is the reason I'm overlapping these 2 webinars, is joint intent requirements apply to applications, not completed applications that you see in letter C. So when we have an application, we need to be documenting when there's more than one applicant their intent, not when we have a completed application. And there's a fine little difference, but it really doesn't matter because we're going to do it earlier than later. In fact, I like to say that we need to get joint intent documentation at the initial application, just to clarify what that means. Because in the real world, a lot of times, when do I really have an app, and it comes in pieces and phases over time, and especially if we're talking about ag and commercial loan officers, it isn't kind of a one and done like we see on the consumer side. So I like to always train those loan officers that it's the initial application. It's that initial contact where they say, I'd like to, and you say, who's I? Is it you and somebody else or just you? And that's how we move forward in this. So back to application. An oral written request made in accordance with your procedures. And letter B, we talked about procedures a lot last week. That's your actual practices. You might tell me that we always require to have a form filled out, but I bet that's not always true. It's very common that loan officers will take applications over the phone where they're filling out a piece of paper, or they're meeting with somebody outside the bank. Maybe it's on a yellow pad. Yes, we'd like to have those forms that we call an application form filled out, but that's not always the case. If you look at letter C, a completed application is when you get all the information that you're ready to obtain and consider for the type of credit requested. And if you look at the very last sentence, it says, the ball's in your court, though, lenders. The burden's on you to exercise reasonable diligence in getting what you need. But again, joint intent requirements stem off of the initial application, not a completed application. If you go to page 2 with me, there's a thing about the diligence requirement that I just mentioned in paragraph C, and basically it's saying, again, the burden is on you. You've got to make requests. I like to say, loan officers, you're in the business of making sales or loans. So you need to ask for what you need, and when you don't get it, you probably follow up with those people, and you'll want to document that. Let's look at the bigger picture for a second. Equal Credit Opportunity Act is a fair lending regulation. It does say that you cannot consider somebody's race, sex, age, mental status, national origin, etc., but it also says that you cannot be seen as discouraging someone. And it doesn't mention protected classes. You can't discourage anybody from applying. So this diligence requirements may be bigger than you realize. You want to prove to your field examiners when they come in your bank that you're not dragging your feet, but that you made requests for certain information and the applicant failed to provide that information if that's the case. So you're going to want to document that you left them a voicemail, that you sent them a letter, that whatever you did to make those requests. Maybe more than one request was made. That's demonstrating this diligence requirement. That's to satisfy the word reasonable diligence. I hate words like reasonable. Okay. On page 2, you'll also see that other webinar that I'm referring to that was held on November 14th. And there's a link there. If you were not able to attend that, I would recommend that you listen to that as well and put these two together, because they're really the two chapters of this book that we need to understand the application process. Well, let's get into page 3, so we start to get a little more of the meat of this webinar, what it's about. And the first thing I want you to notice is the citations in letter A and letter C. They're both 1002, which is Reg B, of course, and they're subsection 7, 7D to be specific. 7D is the section that says who can you make sign and what can you make them sign. And I'm going to, again, kind of give you a little bit of the cliff notes here. Joint intent is really a commentary to 7D. There is no separate section for documenting joint intent. It's only in the commentary, and there's a lot of vagueness to it, and that's why this really turns into a 2-hour webinar, is because there's a lot of things that we just have to impose or infer or read the preamble to this rule that came out in 2004 and find out what are they really trying to get at here. And if you understand the big picture, and that's what I'm about to get into, then we can start to put some practical application of real-world situations and say, do we have to have them check those stupid boxes and or initial those things, and where does all that play, and how do we get that done? So first off, at the very top of page 3, Reg B, or Equal Credit Opportunity Act, says you can't make somebody that's not applying sign any kind of liability. Well, let's read it more specifically. Letter A, you can't require the signature of a spouse. They specifically nail spouses, or anybody. And I don't know why they just don't say you can't require the signature of any person other than a joint applicant. Now, right away, this is where this starts to come into play then, because if there's joint applicants, I need to have what I'm going to call my get-out-of-jail-free card. Hey, I'm not requiring John to sign for Jane or Jane to sign for John. That's what they wanted, is what joint intent is all about. Now, I hate the next few words. It says you can't require them to sign any credit instrument. Well, what do you mean by that? And we'll get to that in just a second. And then it goes on, if